Tonight the topic is soils and composting, and we'll turn it over to Moorhead, where Randy Nelson will be presenting.
Okay, thanks Linda. Here's Randy. He is the extension educator for Clay County.
Thanks, Ben. Well, welcome everyone. Tonight we're going to be talking about soils first, then we'll move on to composting. And let me just change this over to... All right. So as you all know, soils, of course, is a very complex subject matter, so we're just going to go over some of the basics tonight. And I also need to give credit to my colleague, Ben Arlt, because Ben is the gentleman who prepared the soils presentation that you're going to see tonight. So first of all, this definition comes from Soil Science Society of America. Soils are complex mixtures of minerals, water, air, and organic matter forming at the surface of land. So what does soil do? Well, it acts as a medium for plant growth, and of course, part of its duties would be anchoring the roots, supplying water, provides air for plant roots, and it also supplies minerals for plant nutrition. And it's a habitat, of course, for organisms. There are a lot of microorganisms that are present in the soil, and it's also involved in recycling nutrients, and Ben discussed that during the last session. So next we're going to move on to the soil complex. We'll talk a little bit about physiology, basically the house for all the biology that takes place. We'll talk a little bit more about how soil is put together, or the structure of soils, and also micro and macroorganisms. Chemistry, basically the mineral charges, and biology, which of course is very important in cycling, and I'm sure you're all aware that soils are truly alive. In this slide you're looking at the texture pyramid, and basically the texture describes the relation of the particle size and the soil profile. So I believe you can all see the arrow on here. So here we have our percent of clay increasing from 0 up to 100. We have silt over on this side going from 0 to 100%, and sand going from 0 to 100%. So the various combinations of sand, silt, and clay will give us the soils that lie within here. So for example, if we had a soil that was, let's just say 20% sand, which we write over here, and let's say 60% silt, and then 20% clay, we would have a silt loam. So that's basically how you read this, and again, the various combinations of these three would give us these soil textures that you see here. Soil structure. This definition comes from the Cooperative Soil Survey, and they define soil structure as a grouping or arrangement of primary particles, which would be sand, silt, clay, and organic matter, into larger secondary particles called aggregates or PEDs. So when you think about soil aggregates, you have to think about how they're held together. And some of the ways that they're going to be held together include via root hairs and also through the root secretions. Soil organic matter, and when you think about aggregates, you can think of the root secretions as well as the organic matter helping to stabilize those aggregates in water. So when they're actually in water, they're not just going to fall apart on you. And also think about organisms as well. And the example given here, we're going to look at earthworms, and they certainly enhance soil structure via burrowing because they do increase our macropores in soil, which will help with our water infiltration. And castings, of course, are nutrient rich and also help to add soil structure. And the next slide, we're going to look at three soils, and we're starting out on the left side. We can see a soil that is in good condition. In the middle here, we have one that's in moderate condition, and the one on the right in poor condition. You can see the nice aggregates over here, and these two just get progressively large clumps of soil. And this comes from www.informedfarmers.com. Soil organic matter, this is of course living material, and it could have came from plant debris, insects, and microorganisms. And humus, which is basically a more stable form of soil organic matter. And obviously you all know that organic matter is very important, mostly contains carbon, and this certainly improves soil structure. In sandy soils, you can think of organic matter as improving the water holding capacity, and if you think about clay soils, generally speaking, we have a slow water infiltration rate, so adding organic matter is actually going to help increase our water infiltration rate, and it's going to improve the tilth, or the physical texture of the soil, and it's also going to help to lower bulk density. and allows for better root systems. A little on soil chemistry. Of course, clay particles and humus have a negative charge, and you can take a look here. Here is our clay or our humus particle, and you can see the negative charges around here, and you can see some of our cations, or our positively charged ions. We have magnesium, hydrogen, calcium, potassium, sodium, just to name a few. And you can see how they are attracted towards this clay particle. And I should also mention too that part of aggregation is performed by clay particles actually not necessarily adhering together, but it's known as flocculating or flocculation. And basically what is happening is that the clay particles again having the negative charge on here, they're going to repel each other. And because we have our cations over here, those cations are able to basically offset that negative charge. And you all know negative charges, of course, are going to repel or disperse. And with enough cations around there and the right cations, those clay particles are actually able to form aggregates. And if you again think about the organic matter and root secretions, are going to help again to cement those aggregates together so they can withstand water, for example, and they're not going to dissolve. So again, clay and humus particles attract ions for plants to take up, and you're also probably all aware about the cation exchange capacity, and basically that's the amount of positively charged ions the soil can hold. And here's just a list of some of the ions that have positive charges. We have calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium, just to name a few. Soil biology. Of course, increasing biology is going to increase the efficiency of nutrients, and decomposition is going to occur more rapidly. And when we get into composting, we'll talk a little bit more about soil biology. So basically, the more microorganisms that are going to be present in the soil, the greater the rate of decomposition. Some of what's in our soil: bacteria, fungi, algae, protozoa, nematodes, earthworms, insects, and various other animals. One interesting tidbit: a single teaspoon of soil may contain more than 50 million bacteria, and animal manures are densely populated with bacteria. Fungi, although some are bad, some are also good. They can help to soften plant debris for further decomposition. And we also have mycorrhiza, which I'm guessing most of you are familiar with, which can form symbiotic relationships with plant roots. And an example that Ben has listed here, legumes, of course, is going to help nitrogen fixation and increase nutrient uptake. And it also will help with soil aggregation. We have algae and protozoa, basically are secondary consumers, and they are believed to be responsible for mineralizing much of the nitrogen in our agriculture soils. Nematodes, I'm guessing most of us are probably most familiar with soybean cyst nematode, and thinking that nematodes are for the most part probably bad, but some do feed on fungi and bacteria, and some can also convert nitrogen into plant available forms. Earthworms, you know, depending on the person, I know people, especially if they walk on their lawns a lot, tend to not like earthworms because they leave those little mounds if the soil's been wet for long enough, but actually earthworms are very beneficial because they do help mix and aerate soil, and through that process they are creating macropores. They can burrow down to 3 feet, especially if conditions are dry. And I'm sure you're all familiar with earthworm castings or worm castings. They of course contain nitrogen, calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus. As far as soil amendments go, before being added to any soil, make sure you test your soils first and try to determine if you do have an issue or problem with your soil. Identify the problems first, and then try to fix them. So if you're low in nutrients, maybe you need to add more nutrients. If you need to adjust your pH, I would say good luck with that, because depending on where you're located, it can be a real challenge. Probably one of the best ways to improve soil would be adding organic matter. And again, this will improve water holding capacity, especially on sandy soils. And adding organic matter, especially to clay soils, is going to improve the water infiltration rate because it will help to form aggregates. It'll also help lower bulk density and allow for better root systems. And you can also think about it as more food for soil biology. And again, the soil's importance to plants, we went over this a little bit already, but again, it's a medium for root growth. Again, it has water, or contains oxygen, water, and nutrients. and it is going to hold nutrients in the soil solution for plants to use. And again, soil biology will help make plant available nutrients. And generally speaking, most commercial fertilizers are going to have plant available nutrients. Sometimes, we just think about using maybe manufactured fertilizers, but let's not forget about the use of manure, because it certainly, in addition to adding nutrients, we're also going to get organic matter by adding manure. And again, by adding manure, we're going to get organic matter, but also bacteria in addition to nutrients. So we can actually, again, improve our organic matter. We can improve our microorganisms in our soil, as well as add nutrients. And some of the intensive livestock operations, they certainly have an excess of manure. And as opposed to just putting raw manure on, it could also be composted first. And some of the benefits of composting manure, you can reduce the total volume. You can help to stabilize some of the nutrients. And again, adding this to nutrient-depleted soils is certainly going to increase the nutrients in that soil. And just a brief review again, soils consists of physiology, chemistry, and biology, and increasing soil life activity by incorporating, you can incorporate manures. It could be from livestock or green manure crops, for example. I know some people are doing that. And in a little while here, we'll also talk about composting. And it could be stuff from the garden or articles from the house. And with that, Ben has a couple of books to recommend. And the first one is The Biological Farmer by Gary Zimmer, and also Building Soils for Better Crops. And with that, here is our list of resources. And like I said, this was just meant for a primer. So at this point, if there are any questions, I would certainly love to try to answer them. And if not, we'll break for about 15-20 minutes for some small group discussion. So I'll wait a minute here and see if there are any questions.
Is that okay?
Hi, we have a question from Bemidji.
Okay, go ahead, Bemidji.
I am concerned about tilling the soil in our garden when and if it's too wet. Can you give us any guidelines? In our situation, we have soil that's pretty sandy, and yet I've heard that you don't want to be working the soil when it's too wet.
Okay, very good question, and you're absolutely right. If it is too wet, you're going to certainly destroy your structure. Now, you mentioned you have a sandy soil, correct?
Right. I mean, it's a matter of what is too wet.
How can you define?
I have discussions about this.
Can you define how sandy your soil is? I mean, are we sandy compared to Fargo clay, or are we talking a lot of sand?
I'd say a lot of sand.
Okay. So
I mean, although we've composted, and so, it's not pure, it's been enriched to a degree.
I know one of the recommendations is if you grab a handful of soil, if you squeeze that in your hand, and if it doesn't stay, let's say in a ball, if it crumbles, you should be fine to go out there and perform some tillage. However, I don't know if that is going to work in your situation. I mean, if it's sandy enough, I don't know if it's really going to matter how wet it is, just because it's still going to fall apart. I don't know if that helps to answer your question or not.
I think, yeah.
Can you actually put your soil into a ball? Have you tried that?
Yes, I have. It doesn't, for the most part, I don't think it balls up very good. Some of this part have more of the composted material, seems to, but that is because of the process. I think it's not necessarily all decomposed yet, but no, even when it's moist, it doesn't seem like, I mean, it'll make a soft, it'll hold together softly.
Okay, but for the most part,
on where? Would you say?
For the most part, it's not forming a ball though when you're balling.
Not a very distinctive. I wouldn't say it. I haven't tested it.
Sure.
Other than because I have heard of that concept. I still worry though about how can you harm the soil? What can happen? What can be the consequences of tilling to?
I can tell you in the valley where I'm located at, if you would go out there too wet, you're basically going to have bricks left in your garden, for example. I mean, until it dries out enough, and hopefully you can get back in and maybe do another tillage and get rid of that. But now in your situation, it's different given the amount of sand that you have.
Yeah, we don't have that problem as far as the workability. I've just heard that it can cause changes in the structure that can be destructive, but.
And again, I'm not aware of that, at least in your soil. However, Jim, Howard, Ben, do you folks have anything to add to that?
Howard, if you're more you till, the more you damage the structure in the soil. And that's why generally in the spring, there's no point in tilling real deep. You just want to kind of work the top so you can get your seeds planted. I don't think you can damage your soil when it's that sandy tilling. You lack some structure that might be there in heavier soils.
Right.
But yours isn't going to turn into a clump and be bothered that way. So tillage is basically just to prepare the top of the soil and so that you can work in the soil and get the seeds planted.
Right. So I've also heard too that you shouldn't till too much, you know, till as little as possible throughout the season. I mean, can tilling have a detrimental effect long-term if you till a lot?
Like Howard had mentioned, it could certainly destroy your structure. And I know in a garden situation, I'm guessing you probably have a good seed bank of weed seed built up. So obviously the more that you till, the more weed seed you're going to bring to the surface. So certainly performing shallow tillage. And I would also encourage the use of mulch would certainly help. But again, that's in a garden situation.
Right.
We have a question in Moorhead. Go ahead.
I just have a question on your organization to use manure for these large livestock or whatever, you know, confined operations. Is there any concern of the amendments or they use antibiotics, they use other things when they feed a lot of these situations? Is there a problem of bringing that manure and that stuff to, you know, especially the organic operation, if they're using that manure?
That is a really good question. Did everybody hear the question? That was about, I'll just go over it. It was about taking manure from some larger operations that maybe don't have organic certification, so they're potentially using antibiotics with their animals, and the concern about using the manure coming from those operations and applying it to soil, especially if you happen to have organic certification. It's an excellent question, and I'll be honest with you, I'd like to open that up to some of our organic growers to see what their thoughts are on that. From my standpoint, I'm not aware of any of the antibiotics that would be given to animals that would impact some of the soil biology. However, if you're talking about having a certified organic farm, I would imagine there may be some restrictions from the organic certifier as to what types of manure could potentially go on. So again, at this point, I would like to open that up to some of our organic growers. And I'm looking at one right now if you'd like to comment. That's Mark Askegard.
I would think if you're going to be using animal manures from a large confinement operation, I would like to see the manure probably composted first, at least. I'm not too familiar with the amount of bacteria or things that would be left after composting, or chemical situation that might be in the bedding or something of the manure could be an issue. So it's best, I would think, to compost everything, you know, before you apply anything on an organic garden.
Like, you know, hormones and antibiotics and different things that, you know, I don't know specifically everything goes, but I don't know, I just wonder if that is a problem with your soil health, you know, you're sticking stuff like that into your soil, and it's not going to be destroyed, I don't think, through the animal ingesting it, is it? I wouldn't think for the most part.
And the follow-up question here was specifically about the antibiotics and what other medicines that could potentially be given to the animals, and basically that not being broken down during the composition of the manure and that impact on soil health. And is there anybody else that would like to comment on that?
Randy, this is Jim in Bagley.
Yes, go ahead, Jim.
I could just add a couple of things to that. That's something, that whole issue of antibiotics in manure on farms is a little bit of a controversial issue, but as of right now, if you are a certified organic farm and you are buying composted manure from a conventional farm, in the case of, say, poultry manure, which happens right near Moorhead, there's a large farm there that is selling composted poultry manure. They do use antibiotics, but it is approved for an organic farmer to use it as long as it was composted And essentially, if it's a food crop, you have to apply it the fall before you grow the crop. If it's a forage crop or a field crop that's not used for human consumption, then it can be applied in the spring. But it's a wonderful question. You know, and that's actually, there's probably a topic there for another whole session on just that very issue of antibiotics. But it's sort of a problem, but right now it is okay, or at least legal, for an organic farm to do it.
Okay.
Thanks, Jim. He was very happy with your answer, by the way.
Oh,
Okay.
I wasn't pressing hard enough. I got a comment. I milk cows, and I used to use larvicide. That goes through the cow and winds up in the manure, so the larva dies when it gets into the manure. So I don't know if you can use it for organic.
Great follow-up, and I'll be brutally honest and tell you I don't know the answer to that one. Jim?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay, yep, Jim back here again at Bagley. Another good question, another controversial issue, because many of the products that are used for internal parasites on ruminants, like in his example, cows, they do go through the animal. The manure is still sort of technically hot chemically, and with enough that it will kill many of the beetles. That's one reason why we don't have very many dung beetles left in many of the pastures, is because of that reason. So, and I don't have a good answer for your farmer either, because aside from rotational grazing and whatnot, there isn't a magic bullet that will control those pests and not harm, you know, the non-targets, like a dung beetle is a good example.
Any other questions or comments?
I guess I got another thing too. Ionophores go through the cow too and are found in the manure, like Bovatec and ruminicin.
Can you explain what those are for people that, such as myself?
Okay. Well, those are actually kind of an antibiotic that goes into the stomach, and it keeps certain bugs from developing, so they don't produce the kind of, I'm sorry, I've been up since 2 o'clock. And I've been working. It produces, it helps keep certain, what do they call them? Certain acids from being produced that are easily transferred into gas, so the cows don't dispel the gas. Instead, they keep the energy inside themselves so they can use it for their production.
This is Howard in Thief River. That rumensin is one of them. That's also a coccidiostat, so certain parasites again are inhibited, and the ionophores, like you said, they enhance feed efficiency. And but you're right, they do go through the animals to some degree after.
Any more questions or comments? Great discussion so far. We have a question in Moorhead.
I was just wondering what mineralizing nitrogen means.
Okay, the question is about mineralizing nitrogen. Basically, when we talk about mineralizing nitrogen, and anyone please feel free to jump in here, basically the plant is going to take it up in an inorganic state. So when you mineralize, you're going to basically go from an organic form into an inorganic form, and it's going to take soil microorganisms in order to help along with that process. And there are some issues that can take place that, you know, could say allow you to lose nitrogen during that process. But again, basically mineralization, basically you're going from an organic form into an inorganic form.
Is one form better than another?
Again, plants are going to take up the inorganic form. The organic molecule is just too large for the plant to take up. So it's going to have to take it up in the inorganic form. And that would, as far as I know, would go for all plant nutrients in the inorganic form.
Can you hear us in Staples?
Yes, we can hear you in Staples.
We have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, in reference to a garden, you talked about only tilling down 1 or 2 inches. My question is, if you put a mulch on there, a lot of times I'll try different things. They mold so bad. Do you want to till that in, or is it just, do you want to just compost it? Does composting get rid of the mold problem?
Take your first question, or actually, I want to clarify something with you first. When you say mulch, what kind of mulch are you using?
Well, just old leaves and different, whatever, just something to knock the weeds down. Maybe straw, weeds, whatever.
Okay, now you mentioned you're having mold. Is that mold forming right at the soil surface, or you're just noticing it all over the mulch itself?
I put it on my strawberries, and they were kind of partially shaded, and they ended up with just all kinds of mold on the wet straw.
Okay. And you're wondering if you would compost that first, if that would help?
Well, does composting get rid of that problem, the mold? And
again, I'm not sure what kind of mold you're having on your straw. If you were to compost it, I mean, basically you'd get, almost like a soil-like amendment when you're done. Mm-hmm. Is what most finished compost that I've seen what it looks like. It's usually kind of a dark brown, black color, and it doesn't have a whole lot of a smell to it if it's been composted well. So I don't know if doing that would be a whole lot of benefit to you. I would say if you're mulching your strawberries, are you noticing any damage to your strawberries from the mold that's on the straw?
Well, no, it's just kind of nasty to work around.
Okay. Any particular kind of straw that you're using?
I just got some bales of straw from at a farm and put it around the strawberries, and I figured that would, the cycles would be dry and wet, of course, and it would just stay straw, but it deteriorated and started to mold, and I'm just wondering how you get around that.
Okay. In your case, I don't know if you're going to get around that at all. It could be in part, I guess, where it's located at. Most of the straw mulch that I've seen I haven't seen it mold like that.
Okay.
You had mentioned leaves. Have you tried that?
Yeah, I've tried. I've also used some grass. Maybe it was something from the lawn. I'm not sure.
I don't have anything to, I guess, add to the straw. If you wanted to try leaves, I mean, that would certainly be another option. I would just make sure if you run them through a lawnmower first, that way you can chop them up. They're not as likely to, say, flatten if you go that route. But otherwise, I would recommend both leaves and straw because they work well for strawberries.
Well, that's what I was wondering what you would recommend. And then I guess my basic question was if I went to composting, would that be a much better substance to use just for a top of a bedding for getting rid of weeds and stuff?
Some people have used finished compost. However, I don't know that I would actually I don't think I'd ever use compost in a strawberry operation because you'd have some really dirty strawberries when you were done. One nice thing about having straw or leaves is that at least you have some protection from the soil. You don't have any soil strawberry contact usually. Now, if you can imagine putting compost, of course, in there, you'd certainly have an issue. Mm-hmm. Another option that you would have you ever heard of the product called Mulch?
No, I haven't.
I know it's available. I'm not sure how expensive it is, but it's basically it's discards from the wool process, and then they also take some wood scraps, and it's basically woven together. And some people have gotten a couple of years worth of mulch use out of that, specifically on strawberries.
Right. I didn't mean to get off track. But I've always tilled down as deep as my tiller could go. So this is very, very informative, and I'm just trying to figure out what to put on top instead of tilling. Well,
tell you what, also if you're incorporating mulch, for example, if you're going through and, say, tilling in straw or leaves at the end of the season, I'm with you. I would till as deep as that tiller can go because you want to make sure that you get really good incorporation. Same would hold true if you're actually adding amendments to your soil. If you're going to add, whether it be some sphagnum peat or maybe some compost, I would recommend, and I believe most U of M literature would recommend, to till that in as deep as possible.
Okay, so why is that okay to till it in deep? Is that just in the fall? Why did you want to do that in the spring? Oh, no, we're talking about wet, weren't we?
I think I missed what you said there.
We were talking about when it was wet, I'm sorry.
When it was wet, correct.
Okay, thank you.
In this case, as far as working that into the soil, I mean, you want to make sure you get it mixed well, because you want to avoid forming any type of layers by, say, doing shallow tillage by just to incorporate compost or peat.
Okay, thank you very much.
That you get it distributed well. Yeah, very good question. Hopefully I was able to answer that with a very
that's great.
long
Yep.
answer. Okay. Any other questions or comments? All right, hearing none, I think we should break out into some small groups for about 15 minutes. And when our time's up, we'll come back and focus on composting. All right, everyone, I think we're going to go ahead and get started with composting. Can you all hear me? Can you hear Moorhead?
This is Crookston. We have a fast question.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question about. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay. I have a question about earthworms, and I was a graduate, natural resource graduate, and we were brought up, you know, in kind of the realm of invasive species and native species and that sort. And earthworms weren't traditionally in this part of the country. We essentially brought them here, and I'm just kind of curious, you know, when we were talking about ecosystems and that sort, and this region, you know, traditionally being prairie pothole and you know, basically prairie grasses, that, you know, ants were a big player in soil structure, and I'm just kind of curious as to the relationship between, you know, those different types of species, and if there's been any look at the, you know, local farm scale of using earthworms or not using earthworms, and if, you know, if there's other species or native species that might be better for plant production and that sort.
Sounds like an excellent question, and I don't even know how to address that one, so I'm going to open it up to our very knowledgeable attendees. If anybody would like to comment on that, please feel free.
You're certainly right, though. They are invasive, and they're not native.
Should I ask them?
I mean, that's certainly true, but they are, you know, so ubiquitous now. I don't know what you do with them for the most part. They're getting our native forests and doing havoc with the understory and stuff, you know. So they are. I mean, depending on how you look at them, they are good soil builders. They certainly do a wonderful job of, you know, breaking down material, organic material, you know, and making it usable for plants. But that's a big question. I don't know where to go from there.
Yeah, good point. Jim, Howard, any thoughts?
We're having a deep discussion on this, and you're right. All of the earthworms, whether it's night crawlers or regular, they're all invasive species technically. But what we're looking at, whether you use fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer, whether you use earthworms or anything else that breaks down organic matter in the soil, that releases nutrients to your plants, and that's positive. The problem would be if you're not replacing those nutrients, if you're not adding more organic matter or nutrients to the soil, then it's like throwing gas on the fire. The earthworms and the nutrient or the fertilizer will speed up the breakdown of organic matter in the soil, helps your plants grow while it's breaking down, but you have to replace it because now you've sped up that process, you've used it up if you don't replace it. Worms are part of that process.
That's a good answer.
Any other comments?
We have another question in Bemidji.
Go ahead, Bemidji.
Thinking about preparing a garden, how can one kill quackgrass organically and still be an organic type gardener?
Gosh, that's a really good question.
Is Roundup a no-no? Roundup a no-no?
If you're striving for organic, I believe it would be.
A no-no.
If you've been dealing with quackgrass for a while, I mean, you obviously know it's a very tough perennial grass to get rid of. It has miles and miles of rhizomes. I guess one thought would be, you could certainly try black plastic over it and see what happens there. I would guess you're probably not going to have a whole lot of success with that. Generally speaking, I would not, I was going to say I wouldn't recommend tillage, obviously, because you're going to slice the rhizomes and you're usually going to create more of an issue. However, if you weren't afraid to continually till that garden site until there was no green left, and we're talking consecutive tillages to go through, basically you're just going to try to wear out that plant's carbohydrate reserves to kill it, would be an option. But obviously that can be detrimental as well.
Right.
Any other? I'll open this one up too. Any thoughts about killing quackgrass organically?
Yeah, this is Jim here in Bagley. No magic bullets, but another one that we discussed here a little bit was the use of black plastic will work, but it's light enough that the grass tends to push it up. But if you use something heavier like a tarp, and I was explaining that you can actually purchase used billboard tarps for very little money that are fairly large, and that along with something to weight it down, that will eventually work, but it does take some time. So it's not a magic bullet, but basically you have to essentially smother it so it can't photosynthesize, and you have to try to wear it out that way.
So do you think one summer of working at it? Yes.
Well, yeah, we have nodding yes and nodding no here, so maybe. I guess that's the answer. I would think that if you had an area that you wanted to start a new garden, I think you would have a reasonable chance of getting it under control. And many areas aren't exactly solid quack either. Probably even a tougher one is if you have thistles, Canadian thistle. That's even a tougher one because it has such an extensive root system that goes so deep. So that's another challenging one too. So no magic bullets there.
Jim, this is Randy. Those that were nodding yes, could you ask them roughly how long they left the tarp in place?
Yeah.
Okay, Mike?
Okay. All summer, I used lumber cover from the lumber yard.
Oh, she used a lumber cover from the lumber yard. Is that the plastic thing you're talking about? Yeah, so that would have the consistency pretty similar to a lightweight tarp. And she claims some success with that.
And was that in place the whole summer? So we're talking at least a good 3 months?
How long did you leave it on?
All summer.
All summer, she says.
Okay. Yeah, those that were nodding their head no, what did they try?
Okay, I'll put him on.
Spreads it out.
For multiple years, you can actually beat it. My idea would be in 1 year, you would win for that year. But if you take the plastic off, I would guess that the second year, all that quackgrass would continue to grow.
How about if you followed it up after you planted a crop with some type of an organic mulch afterwards?
Never let it rest. I mean, I'll always keep something on top of it. Forever.
Okay, that's it, forever.
Excellent questions and comments. Any other questions? All right, hearing none, we will go ahead and talk about composting. Again, this is basically going to be a composting primer, and if you flip past the PowerPoint, you all have a handout titled Composting and Mulching, a Guide to Managing Organic Yard Waste. Now, most of the information that you're going to see tonight is going to come from this publication, and I believe there might be one or two more additional resources in that packet. And before I begin, I should mention, all of you should have a survey in front of you. If you would please fill that out, we really value your feedback. And that's also your ticket out of the room. All right, we'll go ahead and begin composting. So what we'll talk about tonight, we'll just do a general overview of composting. We'll talk a little bit about requirements for successful composting. We'll talk a little about materials for composting, some structures, and probably most importantly, how to prepare and maintain a compost pile. So first of all, composting is a microbial process. So we're converting plant material, like you see here, and some non-plant material. You can see the shredded newspaper or office paper over here, and we're hoping to get usable compost that you see in this photo right here. Now this could be used as a soil amendment, and some people also use compost as a mulch. So one of the questions you might have, why compost? Why don't I just put this on as is and till it into the soil? Or do something else with it, and as you can see, one reason to compost, you can keep yard waste out of landfills and burn piles. And I believe a while back there was legislation passed to keep grass clippings and anything basically that we could compost out of the landfills. Also, if you compost, you have a more usable amendment to put into your soil. Sometimes it's handling material that's not composted. It's really bulky. It's really a challenge. And in addition to that, if you add this as a soil amendment, so you could put it on the soil surface and then till it in, or again you could use it as a mulch, but you're going to increase soil organic matter. You can improve the soil physical, chemical, and biological properties. And what those properties are going to include, if we talk about physical properties, in sandy soils we're going to increase water holding capacity, and in clay soils we can improve our aeration and drainage. Some of the chemical properties, we're going to increase the ability to hold and release essential nutrients, and biological properties. We're going to be able to promote microorganisms. In addition to that, if you try to incorporate non-composted organic material into the soil, you may find that you don't like the effects of that. And basically, I mentioned composting takes microorganisms to achieve. So if you put uncomposted material, let's just say you take leaves or straw, or say some small branches, and you actually work this into your soil, you have really good organic amendment, or I shouldn't say organic amendment, but you have really good again, whether it be leaves or straw, in contact with soil. So those microbes that are in the soil, they're going to start breaking that down. Now those microbes are going to feed on nitrogen, and guess what will happen to your plants if you would incorporate enough organic matter into the soil? You could end up with nitrogen deficiency. Now nitrogen's not going to be lost, but it will be tied up until decomposition is complete. At that point, that nitrogen will be released again into the soil, and at some point will be plant available. But again, if you put uncomposted material in and till it in, you can anticipate having some nitrogen deficiency. We'll move on to requirements for composting, and what we'll talk about here is aeration, moisture, particle size, nutrients, turning, and mixing. And aeration is probably one of the most important things that we're going to talk about, because again, since we're dealing with living organisms, we need to give them oxygen. Now, it is important to note that some decomposition will occur without oxygen, but to do this, you need to have you don't want to be doing this outside, because the process is slow, and you can also have a lot of foul odors develop. So if you're living in town, you probably wouldn't want to compost without oxygen. And if you look actually at the back of your handout, they do talk about anaerobic decomposition. And basically what you're using is a plastic bag. You throw all your organic material into there, you tie it off, and you leave it set for several months. So the oxygen content inside of a compost pile should range between 16.5 to about 21%. And how do you get that oxygen level in there? Well, the key to that's going to be free airspace. And initially, that free airspace should be 55 to 65% by volume. And in the handout, there is a neat little testing procedure that you can do. And basically, it involves using a 5-gallon bucket. And basically what you're going to do, take your bucket, dump 5 gallons of water into that bucket, make your mark. And that way you know what your 5-gallon level is. And then from there, you're going to take an amount of compost, fill up to that 5-gallon line, and then you start adding water. And based on the amount of water you put into that bucket, that'll help you determine what your free airspace is. And again, there's a page, I believe, dedicated to that in the handout that describes that process. And again, it's pretty simple to conduct. Moisture is certainly going to be important, and it's essential for microbial activity. Again, we're dealing with living organisms. So you want to water so it's damp, certainly not saturated. And again, if you have saturated conditions, you can guess what will happen. We'll have slow decomposition, foul odors, because we're moving to more anaerobic conditions. Particle size, as you could all understand, smaller particles is going to equal faster decomposition. Basically, we'll have more surface area to be attacked by microbes. And it's recommended that pieces that are 2 inches or larger be shredded. So depending on what you're using, you could run it through a lawnmower, or maybe through some type of a shredder to make sure that the pieces that you're composting are going to be 2 inches or less. Now, you don't want to have all your supplies or all your organic material too small, because obviously those small pieces are going to pack together and you're going to have a very, very compacted pile, and you'll find out that you're not going to have enough free airspace. So it's really a balancing act. Nutrients. Now you might think, well, why do I need nutrients when I compost? If you're thinking that, it's a good question. And we talked about this a little bit before. And again, the organisms that are breaking down our compost, they're going to be feeding off nitrogen. And a shortage of nitrogen is going to slow decomposition. In addition to that, our microbes are going to be affected by what's known as the carbon to nitrogen ratio of organic material. And in a little bit, we'll talk about that. Actually, I'll show you a table with various organic composting possibilities, and that'll give their percent nitrogen along with their carbon to nitrogen ratio. But materials with high C to N ratios, again, slow to decompose, unless, of course, you add additional N. And some examples are sawdust and straw. Again, you can certainly decompose these, but you wouldn't want to have too many of these in your compost pile because, again, they have a very, very high carbon to nitrogen ratio. And here's just a photo of straw. Actually, in this picture, you can see straw being used as a organic mulch in a vegetable garden. So when it comes to nutrients, what are your possibilities? You certainly wouldn't have to use lawn fertilizer. You could if you wanted to, but if you want to stay on the organic side, you could use grass clippings. Now, I'm just curious here. I need the host for some help here, but I'd like a show of hands to find out how many people actually bag their grass clippings. So I'll ask in Moorhead, how many bag your grass clippings? I don't see anybody raising their hands. Perfect. What about the other sites? Do we have anybody that is raising their hands that they bag their grass clippings from their lawn?
Only one that will admit it.
Only one that will admit it. All right, well, you know what? Hopefully I can make a convert out of this person. Yeah, and I should ask before I go on here, does that person want to say why they bag?
They just always have.
He's in a rock.
They always have. All right. That's Howard, correct? Talking? Okay, Howard, at the end, you'll have to let me know if I convince them that they should leave their clippings. One thought, now this really has nothing to do with composting, but since we do have somebody that's bagging, original thought used to be that if we would leave our clippings on, we would accumulate thatch in our lawn, and that's been found to be untrue. So if you're mowing correctly, only removing 1/3 of the top growth, those clippings laid on the soil or laid over the surface of the lawn decompose really quickly, and generally speaking, you get about a pound of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square feet for the season if you return your clippings to the lawn. So basically, it's a whole fertilizer for that season, or one application of fertilizer for the season. But again, if I haven't convinced the person, they can certainly still use grass clippings. as their source. Did I make any headway, Howard?
No, you didn't. He doesn't like to mow his lawn, so if he puts less nitrogen, he has to mow it less.
All right. I'll remember that one. That's good. So, in addition to grass clippings, what else could you use? You could use manure, cottonseed meal, and also blood meal would work. And of course, you could use lawn fertilizer. And the reason lawn fertilizer is recommended is because it's typically high in nitrogen, usually 20% or greater. And I guess if you are using or you're going to use some type of lawn fertilizer, make sure there are no herbicides in that lawn or insecticides. Again, you're just solely looking for nitrogen to apply to your compost pile. All right. Requirements for composting. Again, nutrients. Our initial carbon to nitrogen ratio of all our materials should be about 25 to 30 to 1. Now, if our ratios are below 25 to 1, and again, this is the carbon to nitrogen ratio, we may give off ammonia odors. And if our ratios are above 35 to 1, it could take longer to compost. And we'll talk about the length of composting in just a little bit. But first we'll talk about mixing and turning. Now when you think about it, when you mix, you're going to add some oxygen, but in addition to mixing in some oxygen, you're also taking that outer layer or the outer shell of that compost pile that's not very, it hasn't had a chance to decompose, you're turning that inward. So basically, I mean, you're mixing it up, so if those microbes, if they have decomposed a lot in the center, you're introducing new organic material for them to decompose. And one interesting note, piles that are not mixed, it could take them up to 3 to 6 times longer to become usable. And also mixed piles are going to reach higher temperatures for longer periods. And this, of course, is going to help destroy weed seeds and pathogens. And one thing to point out is that mixing is not going to substitute for adequate free airspace. So I talked earlier about how you can go through and determine roughly the amount of free airspace your compost pile has. So if you're lacking in free airspace and you're thinking that mixing and turning would be able to offset it, it's not the case. Mixing, yes, will increase oxygen, but according to the publication you have in your handouts, it is short-lived, about 24 hours to less than 30 minutes. So how often should you mix your pile? Anywhere from once to twice a month. Basically, when the center begins to cool, that's the recommendation, because at that point those microbes have run out of things to eat. So by mixing it again, you're taking materials that haven't had a chance to decompose, putting them into the center in contact again with the microbes, and they have their food source back. And an actively decomposing pile should be anywhere from 130 to 150 degrees. And maybe some of you have these. If you don't, I've heard they're readily easy to find, but you can get long thermometers that you can actually use to check the temperature inside of your compost piles. You'll also find that during initial decomposition, organic acids are produced and the pH is going to be lowered. Therefore, because of that lowered pH, some sources advise to add lime to the pile to offset that low pH. And generally speaking, it's not recommended because you do take the chance of losing some nitrogen. Now, this is only a general rule, but just so you know that lime may be necessary if you have large quantities of acid materials being composted. But again, generally speaking, lime's not going to be recommended. So materials that can be used for composting, again, leaves work, grass clippings can also work. Again, I would recommend that they stay on the lawn. You can use straw, non-woody plant trimmings. Again, if they're small enough, or if they're not, I would recommend shredding those. Branches recommended. Anything larger than a 1/2 inch in diameter or 8 inches long should be shredded or chipped. Again, we want to make sure that we can maximize that surface area so those microbes can start the decomposition process. Kitchen waste. So in this photo you can see we have some coffee grounds, a coffee filter, as well as some orange pills. So all of these could be used in the compost pile, even eggshells. So what do you want to avoid? This, I'm guessing, is all common knowledge, but obviously feces from humans and pets such as cats and dogs. And in addition to that, you also want to avoid meat, bones, grease, whole eggs, and dairy products, and mainly because you're going to attract animals at this point. Unless, of course, you want raccoons in your yard. And I would also recommend avoiding diseased plant material and also weeds with seeds. And the reason I suggest that is that now most plant diseases and weed seeds are going to be killed if the temperatures stay hot enough. So if they're 130 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 days, that should take care of most of the diseases and weed seeds. However, if you're composting as a homeowner, more than likely your compost pile is not going to be large enough. So you're not going to be able to sustain those temperatures for that duration. And also I wouldn't put any plants that have been treated with a pesticide, so whether that be a fungicide, insecticide, or an herbicide. And just put this in there to check city ordinances. Now since we're in Moorhead, I'm just going to give this one as an example. So anybody within city limits of Moorhead, if you want to compost at home, there are a few rules that you have to follow. And for example, the Moorhead ordinance prohibits the following materials, and we did discuss these as meat and bones, grease and whole eggs, dairy products, human or pet feces. In addition to that, they also have specifications on structure design as well as pile size, and also where you can locate your pile. So I'll go back to that one. So if you're within city limits and you want to start composting, I would first check out your city ordinances, because you'd really hate to go ahead and get your compost pile all set up only to find out that you're not in compliance. Compost structures. There are a lot of compost structures out there. And here we're just looking at a barrel composter, and this one you can purchase. Obviously you can see where the opening is at right here, and you can throw in your material, put the cover back on. You can take this one off the block, I believe, and basically you can just roll it around to mix it. We have some bin styles, and here's just a molded plastic bin with the lid right here. Now if you don't want to go that route, if you're really handy, well, that'll be in the next slide. Well, if you're handy, you can do this one too. You could take a 55-gallon drum, and you can see here they just have holes drilled in the sides of it to get really good aeration. That would work. You could also use a circular bin, and basically they're just using some chicken wire, and the height is about 4 to 5 feet, and the diameter is about 4 to 5 feet. And this one works quite well. But if you're handy and you want to build something, this is a homeowner in Moorhead. He constructed this one. He has 2 spots right here, and you can see he has a lot of shredded newspaper, but a lot of garden greens in here as well. And if you wanted to just start in one side, you could build your compost pile, and then as you mix it, you could just flip it over to the next one if you wanted to, and you could flip back and forth like that, or you could even start 2 batches. But I know he put this together just using pallets and wood that he found, so it didn't cost him anything to get this put together. Here's one from one of your publications, and this has it's a 3-chambered compost structure, and the compost basically would be started in this bin right here, and then as it decomposes and it needs to be turned, they just move it to the next one, and to the next one you can see the decrease in volume. And again, really your choices are endless. So where should you locate your compost pile? One, I'd recommend protecting from drying winds, and I would also at least have it in partial sunlight, because that's going to help heat your pile. Now when you start preparing your compost pile, you're going to start putting it in layers, and we'll go over that in just a minute. And your ideal height is 5 feet, and you want to place coarser material on the bottom of the pile, and again you're building in layers. So your organic waste, put that in a layer 8 to 10 inches deep. Again, your more coarse material towards the bottom. Then you can water that layer until it's moist. Again, not soggy, but just moist. Then you can add a nitrogen source. And again, we went over some organic sources such as manure. And again, you could use bone meal or blood meal. They would all work. Probably blood meal over bone meal. Or if you want to use lawn fertilizer, again, that would work. Or some other end sources. And then if you want to, you could also put in soil or completed compost. And that layer is actually optional. I guess one reason this would be recommended is that you could say that you're inoculating your compost pile, if you will, because you're adding microorganisms either from completed compost or from the soil. However, it's usually not necessary, because everything that you're going to be composting, there are a lot of microbes already on that. So if you want to, you can put soil or completed compost, but you wouldn't have to. So here's just a graph here showing this layering. So again, the yellowish cream colored, that's your organic material layers, again 8 to 10 inches. Then you have your fertilizer or manure layer, and then you have your soil, which again is soil or completed compost, which is optional. So those 3 layers, 2 or 3 depending on how you want to build it, and then you just repeat that until your pile is complete. And again, turn once or twice a month or whenever your pile cools. And again, the recommended temperature, or what it should be at, is 130 to 150. So when it cools below 130, it would be time to turn. If you want, during this process, you can certainly add small amounts of fresh material. However, if you have a lot of material, it is recommended to just start a whole new pile. And again, the initial C/N ratio for rapid decomposition should be anywhere from 25 to 30 to 1. Now here's that table I promised you. So here we have the approximate concentration of nitrogen and carbon to nitrogen ratio of various materials. So if you look at alfalfa, you can see the nitrogen percent dry weight's 2.5, and the C/N or carbon to nitrogen ratio, weight to weight, is 12 to 19. So rather high in nitrogen. Grass clippings, pretty high in nitrogen. Again, that's 2.2%. So again, good to leave them on your lawn. Low C/N ratio of 15 to 25. Now as you go down this list, if you take a look at sawdust and wood that I mentioned earlier, you can see sawdust ranges anywhere from 100 to 750 to 1 for carbon to nitrogen ratio, and wood is actually a bit higher, anywhere from 200 to 1300 to 1. So again, if you're using those two, certainly use them sparingly. Paper anywhere from 200 to 800. And you can see table scraps and livestock manure, good nitrogen sources, and for the most part, they both have a low C/N ratio. Generally speaking, you're going to have usable compost in 2 to 4 months if the pile is well managed, your materials have been shredded, and you have warm conditions. And generally speaking, your finished compost pile is going to be half the original size, and it should have an earthy smell to it. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some other compost. You've probably all heard of compost tea. And this is derived from soaking or brewing compost in water. And that solution is then used as a foliar or soil application to plants. And I'm guessing some of you, if not all of you, have heard of vermicompost. And that is compost that's been digested by worms. And this is kind of neat because your compost does not need to be turned. The worms actually turn the organic matter in their digestive tract, so you just have to keep adding the material to your, basically to your worm box, and they take care of the rest. So in conclusion, I'll just wrap this up. Again, composting is a microbial process, makes a great soil amendment. Again, it's going to increase your soil organic matter, and it's going to help improve your soil physical, chemical, and biological properties. And you're also going to get essential nutrients. And I should also point out that the U of M, one of the U of M publications, and I don't believe I have that one with me, but it gives their soil test interpretations basically for home gardeners. So they talk about lawn care and, or lawns, gardens, and trees. And what they recommend in there is about 100 pounds of moist compost per 100 square feet of garden. And when they say moist compost, anywhere from 4 to 6 5-gallon buckets spread over that 100 square foot area. And then you rake it out, till it into a depth of 6 to 8 inches. And again, to get back to our essential nutrients, they recommend that you can cut your fertilizer rate in half by adding compost. So whatever the recommended fertilizer rate was, if you add that amount of compost, you can cut it in half. So you can certainly save money by using compost. Again, our initial C/N ratio, 25 to 30 to 1, and our initial free airspace should be 55 to 60%. And of course, mix is needed. And with that, here's our list of references. I would certainly like to take any questions at this time or comments.
We have a question here from Lake in the Woods.
Go right ahead.
I was thinking in our master gardening lessons and all, there was mentioned about the red worms that was so detrimental to the forests that we have around us. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
That's an excellent question, and no, I cannot address that. But I'll open up your question to all of our attendees. Does anybody have anything that they can add to that?
This Howard, part of that discussion goes around erosion, the worms the leaves fall off the trees, they get into the soil, and the worms eat the leaves. They add air to the soil, they add nutrients to the soil, and the leaves break down quicker. So it basically allows some of that forest area to erode more effectively, or to cause higher levels of erosion, higher levels of nutrient transfer to streams. I think that issue kind of in the wild that's created, in a garden, I can't see where worms would cause anything but good.
Thank you.
See, Mel, I could add a little bit to that.
Bagley with a question.
To that.
Go ahead.
I don't know the full details. This is stable, but with the worms, they increase the rate of decomposition of that leaf matter or duff layer in the forest. And the problem what I've heard is more in like maple or old growth forests, where it can affect germination and seedling establishment of maples and other types of hardwood species. I don't know if it's related to the nutrient content or if they need that duff layer for germination and establishment, but it has something to do with that. So in the natural forest setting, it can be a negative.
Question from Bagley.
Can you explain what you were talking about based on the soil samples and using compost as a replacement? I didn't really catch what you were saying there.
Okay, I sure can. Again, if you have a soil test that you had sent, or I should say, if you sent in a soil sample, you get your soil test results back. Let's just say you're putting in the garden, and they're recommending so much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. If you add compost, again, and the U of M recommends about 100 pounds of moist compost per 100 square feet, which again is about 4 to 6 5-gallon pails full, spread over that area, tilled in, you can actually cut your rate of fertilizer in half. So for an example, let's just say you're supposed to add 20 pounds of nitrogen to your garden. You put that amount of compost, you could cut your nitrogen rate in half to 10 pounds. Does that clarify?
That's good. That's very good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions or comments?
Could you explain the process where the lime decreased, or made the nitrogen degas or whatever, decrease the amount of nitrogen?
Okay, the question is about adding lime and how that can decrease the amount of nitrogen. And I am going to refer you back to your back to that initial handout, which is the composting and mulching. That gives a really good well, I should say it explains it in there far better than what I would be able to tell you. So I don't mean to dodge your question, but it explains better in there.
Are you talking about this, the one that we haven't gone through yet?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I might have missed something in your question.
I thought I was following the slides as you went through and I didn't see that.
Okay. Tell you what, hang on a moment. I will see if I can find that spot for you in this handout, and I will refer you there. Okay, actually I'll just read right from the publication. It's on page 3. And if you look under the heading turning or mixing, okay. And if I have your question, if I understand it correctly, this is what you're referring to. So under turning or mixing, paragraph 2, it says during the initial stages of decomposition, organic acids are produced and the pH drops. Some sources suggest adding small amounts of lime to maintain and enhance microbial activity at this time. However, high rates of lime will convert ammonium nitrogen to ammonia gas, which in turn will lead to the loss of nitrogen from the pile. And it goes on to say research has shown that the loss of N from the pile often offsets the benefits of lime. And they have a 1 behind that, and if you check back in the references section, it will list the reference, which is the reclamation of municipal refuse by composting. Did that answer your question?
Okay, I'll try to look that up, thanks.
Okay, you're welcome. Any other questions or comments?
We have one in Crookston.
Go ahead.
My compost pile is for the most part pretty successful, with the exception of citrus fruit. I have a hard time getting it to decompose. Any tips or suggestions on how I can get my citrus peels to decompose more quickly?
Your citrus peels, are they rather large, or are they in small pieces?
They're grapefruit and oranges cut into quarters.
Okay. You know, one thought, if you could maybe chop them in half or quarter them, that you'd be able to have more of the surface area exposed. That could help. And then my next question would be, how often do you turn your pile? Are they incorporated well into your existing compost pile?
In the summer it gets turned a lot more,
Okay.
but it just seems like as I'm turning it, these old citrus fruits just keep popping up.
Okay. My only thought would be maybe you can try cutting them just again to reduce the size. You might have some more benefit.
Okay. That leads me to one more question. You had mentioned turning your compost pile once or twice a month, and I'm wondering during winter months if that's necessary.
That's a really good question. As far as turning it during the winter months, at least on a homeowner scale, I don't think you'd have to. I mean, it's cold enough. I just don't think it would. I think it'd be more detrimental to the pile. I think you'd cool it off too much. So I wouldn't worry about it. I would only worry about that during the growing season.
Okay.
Anyone else?
Jen, do you have to use night crawlers, or can you use regular garden worms for composting? Well, which ones work the best?
That's a really good question. What kind of worms work best for composting? So are you referring to vermicomposting?
Yes.
Okay. And I have no experience with that, so I am not sure what kind of worms are recommended. So I'm glad we have a smart audience that's able to answer most of the questions tonight. So I'll open it up to the audience. Is anybody experienced with vermicomposting and know what kind of worms that they should be using?
Red wigglers.
Red wigglers, okay. Any particular reason why red wigglers?
I can't remember, but that is the trend.
Vertical. So the night crawler can mostly on top, and then it's the top part of it. So but the red wigglers are more vertical, so they'll just
All right, thanks, Ben. Other questions or comments?
What time of year is best for incorporating the compost?
Incorporating into your soil?
Yeah.
Okay. If it's finished compost, you could certainly incorporate it in the spring, or actually anytime during the season. So if you're looking for nutrient benefits, for example, you could incorporate it into your garden right away in the spring, prior to planting, of course, and that way, again, you can cut down on what you would need to add as far as synthetic nutrients. Or again, if you wanted, you could really do it anytime.
Okay. Well, I haven't got into any real fancy structures or anything, but it seems to me that a person would have to have at least probably more than one batch per summer. Like you have to have space for 2 different piles due to the time it takes to finish. Is that what other people have found?
I'll open that one up. That's a really good point, because actually having 2 spots would be beneficial. That way you could have one active and one starting. But those that are composting, is that what you do?
We use both, just an area out on the edge of the wood, and then we also use rotating barrel. So we have two different things happening at the same time.
Thank you.
Can you compost in the wintertime?
Can you compost in the wintertime? You could sure try. Again, if you're trying this outdoors, I don't know that you're going to have much success, again, just due to the cold weather in general. However, you can certainly compost in your house. We went over, you could certainly do in your house, or the vermicompost. Again, I'm not familiar with that one, but I know the boxes that they sell, you know, you can use them in your house, and you could be doing that year round. Okay, Rubbermaid, that was brought up in Moorhead, Rubbermaid containers. So if you wanted to do something in the, say, late fall, winter, you could certainly give that a shot.
Okay, thank you.
I mentioned the anaerobic composting. And that basically, you're putting all your stuff into a heavy-duty garbage bag. So you could do that, put all your material in there, and then tie it off securely, and then put it in a, you know, in your basement or somewhere where it's not going to get disturbed, and leave it for several months. You know, that would also work.
Okay.
Sounds like it might explode. Just
The question is about the anaerobic, and you certainly could. As far as I know, I don't know that it would really matter. I would assume, though, the more air you could get out of there, probably the better off you're going to be. But I don't know how if there's a critical balance there or not. Good question.
Don't put it by your furnace.
Can you put in your own natural type of a heater? I mean, can you put a heater in, and will that speed up your time if you use some form of a heating source?
That's a really good question. You know, I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I would assume that if your pile is big enough, you know, again, maybe around the 3-4 feet, somewhere in there, and it's active, I don't necessarily know that you need a supplemental heat source.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know the answer.
Okay.
I got a question on those that have composted. You know, a lot of we hear 4 foot high, 5 foot high, same width. Those can be fairly big sized piles. What do most people do for turning their compost piles? And how, I know that what's recommended, but I kind of wonder what most people are actually doing. For me, it seems like my pile gets too big, and I have to turn it whenever I borrow a bobcat. So I get too much in a pile.
This is Ben in Moorhead. If you were at the last one, you know, on-farm interactions, this would be a great place to incorporate pigs. Just a thought.
We have another question here from Lake of the Woods. Yes.
Go ahead.
I have compost, it was quite an expensive one. It was black on the outside to draw heat, and it's a twin, so you can have one fixed processing and starting another one. And they advise turning that at least several times a week on that during the summer to aerate it. It's a barrel mounted on a pivot, and it's twin. I was thinking when they were talking about how often, you know, for turning it, that didn't seem to be often enough.
And that's a really good point, and generally speaking, the turning would be for, I guess, compost piles, so not the, maybe not the barrel. Maybe in that case, you would have to turn them more often, so that's a really good point. The gentleman who was talking about, or asking about how often to mix, you mentioned that you use a bobcat, so how big are your piles?
Well, I had a lot of old straw that I had to cover a septic system with, and then I had some hay that wasn't real good, so I had to mix in with a lot of turkey litter and food waste and whatever else that I had on hand. So my pile when it was mixed, it was probably 6 to 7 feet high and about probably 10 feet wide. It's probably right now, I'm sitting here in the winter, it's probably about 5 feet high and maybe 6 feet wide, I suppose. So still a little bit bigger than I should. I probably should have split it into 2.
How does it look? I mean, it sounds as though it shrunk quite a bit.
Yeah, it shrunk quite a bit. I think my biggest thing is I just need to add more nitrogen source because it's so much hay in it.
Okay.
But I mean, just the feat of turning it by hand got to be quite a bit.
That could be your weekly workout.
Randy, you mentioned shredders. Is there something that a person can get reasonably, like from a discount store or something for doing that, other than just going out with a shovel, hitting it with a shovel or something? That's what I've been doing.
I think the key word there is reasonably, because as you know, I mean, money is probably the limit here for when it comes to shredders. And I'm not sure what some of the small shredders, because you can get the, I guess, I don't know, for lack of a better term, the homeowner units for shredding branches. You know, you could probably get those, I would think, you know, for a few $100s. I don't know if that would be, I guess it would depend on what you're putting in there. If it's some smaller branches, I would sure think that would work. Now, you know, if you're going to try to shred larger material, gosh, I just don't know what that would cost. Ben in Moorhead suggested renting a wood chipper. Any thoughts, Ben, as to what that would cost or who you could even rent that from? That's true. Have you seen those at rental stores?
Yeah.
You have, okay. All right. But that would be a good option then. Again, Ben mentioned renting one, because you'd have a pile of, you know, whatever you have to shred, so you could do it all at once. Community, also community shredding party was brought up.
Yes, I have horses, so I do have a large compost pile which has straw in it and pine shavings, and I guess my question is, I do leave it for 3 years because I do have horses, but the straw that have been getting, I know has been sprayed with Roundup, and is it safe to use that compost after 3 years in my garden?
Okay, that is a really good question. So the straw that you're using has been sprayed with Roundup.
Yeah.
Now, are you an organic grower or applying this to areas that are certified organic or for your own use?
It's for my own use.
All right. Do you have access to the Roundup label
Yes.
of the product that was being used? What you could do, you could check on there. If there are any restrictions as far as composting, whatever's been sprayed, it should be on there. And kind of on a side note, I know when it comes to, you know, let's say if you're collecting grass clippings, for example, some of those products can take many months to break down. And on those labels, it'll let you know, it'll say if you apply this chemical, you have to wait 2 or 3 or however many weeks before you can start collecting grass clippings to utilize again as a compost. Again, when it comes back to this, I would refer back to the label and see if there are any restrictions on when you can use this for a compost.
This has been in Moorhead. One label to watch is milestone. I know you can, that does accumulate through animals and it will burn up your garden. So read that label carefully and know if you're getting hay or straw from something that's been sprayed with milestone.
I should ask you this, the straw that you have that's been sprayed, have you used any of this as a soil amendment?
Well, I have, for the factor that I guess I wasn't thinking that they're spraying the wheat before harvest with Roundup, and then of course it's baled.
Okay.
And I mean, I didn't look that far into it, that this has spray on it.
Okay. And
Randy, I've looked I looked at the Roundup label before, and I don't think you're going to have any trouble with Roundup. It binds to organic matter quickly. It breaks down fairly quickly. As a herbicide, I wouldn't be worried about that one. 2,4-D and some of this other stuff would be far more serious than Roundup. I don't think you're going to have any trouble at all.
Randy, this is Jim in Bagley. If someone has compost and they're concerned about it, one way would be to do a soil bioassay, which is just sort of a fancy term for taking some of it, mixing it with soil, and plant some seedlings or some seeds in it this time of year. And something sensitive like cucumber or tomato or pumpkin, and if there is any herbicide residue in there, you'll see it instead of waiting until the garden season.
What about broadleaf?
That's a really good point. Thanks, Jim and Howard. Did those two answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Any other questions or comments?
Well, since we're on the chemical end of it, I use preen in my garden. Is there any danger of using old vegetables and things, throwing them back in? Do you know any information about preen, if that's something that would get into your compost or go up into the plants, or that just kills the germination of the seeds?
It prevents some of the weeds from, it would prevent them from emerging. It wouldn't stop germination, but so as that, you have that done usually prior to germination, as that seed germinates and emerges, it basically hits that barrier. And at that point, that herbicide will move through the plant to wherever its mode of action. And of course, you have to have a susceptible weed. But my question would be on your preen. Do you know what kind that you use? Because preen does sell a couple of different products. One for the organic market, which is corn gluten meal, and the other one would be trifluralin.
Yeah, it's a trichloride. It's not the organic one.
Okay. You know, I would suspect that you wouldn't have any issues there at all.
Okay. And could you sell vegetables grown from a garden with preen used on it? I mean, I know it's getting off the beaten path here, but I'm just curious.
Tell you what, if you're following label directions, because if you look at that preen label, you're going to find there are stipulations. I mean, with some vegetables you can seed either prior to putting preen down, or you can seed just after putting it down, or they have to be at the 5-leaf stage, for example, or 3 to 5 true leaves. Then you can apply preen. So I would say as long as it's labeled for the vegetables that you're using and you're following label directions, you shouldn't have any issues with selling those vegetables out of there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions or comments? Got a question in Moorhead.
I have two questions. I noticed in the composting and mulching handout, it says partway through the allowable levels in milligrams per kilogram on a dry weight basis are, and it mentions arsenic. So I was just wondering if there would be any concerns with using commercial poultry, at least I know some places in the country, commercial chicken litter as a nitrogen source in compost.
Okay. The question was about using was turkey compost? Or
I know chicken.
Or chicken compost, excuse me.
I know they put arsenic in the feed in some parts of the country. It's contaminating the environment. So would that raise a concern about arsenic in the compost if you use chicken litter, poultry litter as the nitrogen source?
Good question. The question was about using, I'm not sure if everybody heard it, but about using chicken litter, chicken compost, and those birds having arsenic in the feed. So basically, would that arsenic be in the manure? I don't have any experience with that directly, but I would sure guess if they ate it, they passed it out, it could very well be in that compost, and that would certainly be a concern.
Unless it's already leached out.
Yep, that's a good point too.
That's not a win-win situation.
No, I guess in a case like that, if you're uncertain about the source of your chicken litter or chicken compost, I would find a lab that could analyze that for you, because there was a study in this compost and mulching, and I think they checked out 11 different municipal compost sites within Minnesota, and I believe arsenic was one of the chemicals that they were looking at, just to find out what levels were there. So there are labs that would test for it, or if the company is actually selling it, I believe they would have to have that testing done to find out what types of chemicals would be in there. So again, if they're selling it, you could probably just ask to see their, see the sheet of the analysis, and you can just ask them that question. But good point, and yes, I would certainly be concerned about it.
Okay, my other question was about, okay, you mentioned earlier about mulch, how that could be tilled in at the end of the gardening season. Well, if you're using a mulch that's got a high carbon nitrogen ratio, is there anything, could that be a problem?
Okay,
what do you do to kind of counteract that possible issue?
The question was about using a high carbon to nitrogen ratio mulch. So a good example of that would be bark or shredded bark wood mulch on a garden, and would you want to till it in at the end of the season? And I would say no, I would not till it in. I would use either leaves or straw, or I guess something else that's going to have a lower C/N ratio, maybe alfalfa if you can get it. But if you want to use, let's say you only have access to some type of a bark or shredded wood, and you need to use it, what I would do is rake it off at the end of the season, and then go ahead and do your tillage. And then you could just leave it in piles and you could reuse it the following year. But I would avoid working that in, because again, with that C/N ratio being so high, if you go back in there the next season and plant into that, a lot of the nitrogen is going to be tied up in microbes trying to decompose that mulch, and you could have some issues. So again, if you have to use that, I would rake it off prior to tillage. Any other questions or comments? All right. If there are none, thank you for your attention tonight. And like I said, your completed survey is your ticket out. So if you could please hand that in. And I hope you all have a safe trip home.
I didn't get one. You want me to do one?
Yeah.